2022 was a year of stability on Hacking Chinese, consistent but without major breakthroughs. But what was the most popular article? The most popular podcast episode? Let's summarize the year that was and highlight content you really shouldn't miss. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, I am going to summarize 2022, and I will do so by summarizing the best articles and podcast episodes from various angles. So this is an excellent episode if you are new to the podcast, or if you didn't listen to all the episodes in 2022, or if you are just curious about what I thought about the articles and episodes from last year. Before we do that though, I'd like to remind everybody that there is a listening challenge starting on January 10th and it lasts until the end of the month. And the idea here is simply to encourage everybody to listen and share their progress. So head over to challenges.hackingchinese.com if you're interested. As usual, if you're listening to this in the future, you can still head over to Hacking Chinese Challenges to see what challenges are on when you are listening. With that out of the way, let's look back at 2022. And like I said in the introduction, it's been a very consistent year. I've been able to publish an article and a podcast episode every single week without fail, which is nice. But on the other hand, I haven't been able to do much beyond that, so no new courses, no major projects or anything like that. Since I already discussed the reasons for this in the episode from 2 weeks ago, I won't say more about it here. So let's instead look at the 50-ish articles and podcast episodes. The title of this episode is The Best of Hacking Chinese 2022, and best is of course a very subjective thing. So I'm going to do two things here for the articles. First, I'm going to go through 5 articles that I think are the best and that you should really check out if you haven't already, and all of these have podcast episodes as well. Second, I'm going to go through the top 5 articles based on visitor statistics, so a kind of popular vote. After that, I will also talk about the most popular podcast episodes, and this is a little bit weird. I thought that the podcast episode popularity would be closely linked to the article popularity, so if an article gets a lot of traffic from search engines and so on, it follows that the podcast episode should also get a lot of listens. But this turns out to actually not be the case, so there isn't that much overlap between these two. And I don't know why this is the case, but I think it's interesting, and I will talk about the podcast episodes that stand out. First though, let's have a look at the top 5 articles in my humble opinion. At number 5, we have Analyze and Balance Your Chinese Learning with Paul Nation's 4 Strands. This was podcast episode 94, and as usual I will put links to all of these articles in the show notes, and I won't mention that for every article, but if you want to check them out and find links to the articles or the podcast episodes, just check the notes. I love Paul Nation's 4 Strands framework, and I've been using it mostly in professional development contexts for a long time, but this year I wrote an article for how to use it as a learner of Chinese. I think the 4 strands are important because while everybody knows that you can balance your listening, speaking, reading, and writing, not many people think about the different activities that actually go into these labels. There's a very big difference between reading something in your textbook, say the next chapter, and reading a graded reader. Although these would of course both be labeled as a reading, but in Paul Nation's 4 strands they are completely different. Here we have meaning-focused input, so that would be activities where input and understanding the input is the focus. The focus is not grammar, learning new words and so on, it is to understand what's being said or what's being written. And you are not supposed to have too many unknown words or unknown grammar points here. You're supposed to be able to make sense of this mostly without using a dictionary all the time. Meaning-focused output is when you communicate in Chinese with the same goal of communication and understanding, not of practicing a specific pattern or using new words you've seen in your recent chapter in your textbook or something like that. Then we have language-focused learning, which is what most Chinese students actually do all the time. And I think if you take a regular course at university, maybe 80 or 90% of what you're doing counts as language-focused learning. Then finally, the 4th strand is fluency development, where you focus on getting better at what you already know, getting faster, more fluent and so on, not learning new things. So Nation recommends balance between these 4 strands, which is certainly not what we're seeing in classrooms or indeed for most people who study on their own. I would go so far as to say that meaning-focused input and fluency development should make up more than 25% each, and then language-focused learning should really be much less than 25%, but if we can get to a balance here, I think most people would be much better off. So the reason I think this article is important is because it gives you as a learner, or indeed as a teacher, a practical tool you can use to evaluate how you are balancing your language learning activities. And if you figure out that you're doing 80 or 90% language-focused learning, maybe it's time to rethink what you're doing. For most people, this means a lot more listening and reading to Chinese at your own level. Okay, let's move on to number 4 on my personal list, and that is learning the neutral tone in Mandarin. Podcast episode 114. So normally on Hacking Chinese, I talk about how to learn. I rarely talk about the language itself. This is partly because I think there are lots of other people who do this and do it better than I would, and it's partly because I have a niche where I'm talking about how to learn methodology and so on, so I'd like to stick to that as much as possible. However, there are some exceptions, and pronunciation is one of them, because I don't think that there are many resources available that discuss these things in a clear-headed manner, and so when I spot a gap, I write an article. Of course, I already did cover all areas of Mandarin pronunciation in my pronunciation course. You can check that out at pronunciation.hackingchinese.com. But I also try to write articles and record podcast episodes about certain issues that I think are extra important. And earlier, I've been writing about the third tone, which is one of the most popular articles on the site, about the second tone, and now this year, the neutral tone. So what is the neutral tone, and why are people so confused about it? Indeed, I would say it's only the third tone that makes people more confused. The problem here is that there are many ways of describing the neutral tone, and most people go about it the wrong way, in my opinion. Some people even claim that it is the fifth tone in Mandarin, but to get there, you really have to warp the definition of tone here, and I would not call it a fifth tone. And the reason for this is that it doesn't have an inherent pitch contour. So you can't pronounce it on its own, and when you do pronounce it, its pitch contour is perfectly predictable from the other syllables and their tones in the same utterance. The neutral tone is also closely linked to stress, and you can indeed say that the neutral tone is what happens to an unstressed syllable that is reduced, both in terms of tone then, but also when it comes to vowel sounds and the final in general. So I won't go through everything here about the neutral tone, of course, but check out the article and the episode if you want to know more. Next up is number 3 on my list, which is Beyond Tingbodong, and this is indeed a series of articles and episodes, so I'm cheating a little bit here. But I really think that listening ability is both important and interesting, and that's why I've decided to make this in-depth series about this topic. Naturally, I know that everybody isn't interested in this level of detail and the slightly more academic style, but I think that it's important to explore these things for those who are interested in it, and for the rest of you, I do try to summarize important takeaways at the end of the articles, and the remaining articles in this series that will be published in 2023 will also be more practical. Writing articles like these is also a good way for me to work my way through more complicated and complex topics, which is indeed necessary to write shorter and more succinct articles later. So for example, if you read something that I've written about a topic and you found it insightful, say maybe about the third tone or maybe about the neutral tone, this is because there are hundreds of hours of research, teaching and learning behind these articles, even though they themselves might be short and to the point. Okay, let's move on to number 2 on my list, which is how to survive and thrive in a difficult Chinese course. This was podcast episode 82 if you want to tune in. And this topic is very close to my heart because I started learning Chinese in a fairly intensive environment, and I've since also taught Chinese in fairly intensive environments where students are under a lot of pressure and are expected to spend 40 hours or more a week studying. I've also been involved in some professional development work in a program where students do nothing but study language 24/7. All this means that I've spent a lot of time in the past 15 years or so thinking about how students should behave, what they should do, what activities they should engage in and so on to stand the best chance of passing a very difficult course. As I've discussed before on the podcast and on Hacking Chinese, I've also myself deliberately put myself into situations where everybody else's Chinese is much better than mine, and I have to study maybe 10, 12 hours a day just to keep up with the coursework. Now, I realize that this is not for everybody. Indeed, it is for a very small minority. And normally, when I write and when I do professional development or when I teach, it's for more normal situations. And if you're teaching Chinese in a normal, say, high school or something like that, you cannot use these methods because half of your job is to convince people that learning Chinese is interesting. It's to motivate them to listen and read and also give them the confidence to speak and write when they need to do so. Hence, many methods that are quite efficient go right out the window, such as, say, spaced repetition using flashcards, which I would not impose on a normal high school class, but which I would definitely recommend as a complement to the other things if you are enrolled in a difficult course. So if you want to hear me discuss what I've learned about these difficult and challenging learning environments, check out episode 82. Now we've come to my top pick for 2022, and that is How to Become Fluent in Chinese, which is episode 99. Now I know that this sounds like clickbait, but it really isn't. I already talked about Paul Nation's 4 strands a few minutes ago, and this is about the 4th strand, fluency development. So fluent here has a more literal meaning. It does not simply mean very advanced or near native or something like that. It simply means being able to use the language in a flowing, fluent manner without too much interruption and being able to access the things you have learned previously without taking too much time, or at least not so much time that it interrupts communication. This is something you can practice directly, and yet this is done very rarely in most classrooms. A good example of this that most of you will be familiar with is when it comes to speaking, for example. How good are you at explaining why you're learning Chinese? Well, if you've lived in China, you are probably very good at this because you get the question all the time. And you probably don't learn new words and grammar by speaking about your own experience and background, but you certainly get better at retrieving the words you need, putting the sentences together, and so on. At least I remember what it was like when I first started speaking with people more freely. There were some topics, such as this one, where I felt fairly comfortable and could speak rather fluently. And then when moving on to other topics, fluency disappeared. So this is something you can practice directly, and you do that mostly by communicating. This could be listening, speaking, reading, or writing, focusing on things you already know. So if you're reading or listening, the Chinese you hear or listen to should be entirely familiar with maybe some occasional word here and there. And when you speak and write, you should focus on topics you are familiar with. Maybe you've read a lot about them, you've listened to people talking about them, so you know all the words and grammar already. You just need to practice getting these things out in a comprehensible and fluent manner, and this is fluency development. Generally speaking, people focus way too much on learning new words and new grammar, but what usually makes a bigger difference for your ability to use Chinese is how well you know the basics. So those were my top 5 picks from 2022. And I realized that I'm almost 15 minutes into this episode and I still have the popular vote and the podcast episodes, so I'll try to be a little bit more brief when we talk about the most popular articles. Number 5 is How to Learn Chinese Pronunciation as a Beginner. This was podcast episode 88, and here I summarize the most important advice for how to learn pronunciation as a beginner. As long-time listeners will be well aware of by now, this mostly involves a lot of listening, focused listening where you pay attention to what people say, and of course also mimicking. And when I say mimicking here, I mean listening to a native speaker saying something, or a recording of a native speaker saying something, and then repeating this along with them as they are saying it, and then doing this over and over until you can reproduce exactly what they said. Another word for this is shadowing, but it doesn't really matter what you call it. The important thing is that you do it. So moving on to number 4. Do you have to learn to write Chinese characters by hand? And this was episode 97. If there were to be a civil war among teachers of Chinese, it would probably be over the question of handwriting. So on the one hand, some people say that, yeah, of course you need to be able to write by hand, otherwise you are really not learning Chinese, and this is also a great way of learning more about characters and so on. Then on the other hand, we also have people who say you don't need to learn to write anything by hand because in a digital modern society you don't have to do that. You can type, or when you really have to write by hand on, say, a form at the airport or the bank or something like that, you can just use your phone and copy the characters. You don't have to be able to write them from memory. I put myself somewhere in between because while I think that handwriting can be useful and it's good to learn a few characters at least so you know what it's about and how characters are structured and so on, I also realize that you don't actually need to write by hand. I never write by hand at all in Chinese these days except when I'm teaching, which is the only reason I maintain the ability to write by hand at all. So the boring answer is, of course, that it depends. If you are planning to teach Chinese, then maybe it's good to learn to write more characters by hand, but if you're just an ordinary student learning some Chinese, you don't need to spend thousands of hours learning to write everything by hand. Naturally, not even if you are going to teach Chinese, you need to be able to write everything by hand, as long as you are okay with being looked down upon by more traditional teachers. Number 3 on the popular list is learning classical Chinese is for everyone. No, seriously. This is actually the only article that doesn't have a podcast episode because it isn't written by me. Instead, this is a guest post written by John Renfro from Outlier Linguistics, where he talks about learning classical Chinese. I'm very happy that this article turned out to be very popular because John spent a lot of time writing this and it also took a fair amount of time to edit it. It's not a surprise that it's popular though, because there really aren't that many good resources around for how to learn classical Chinese, especially not if you are an independent student learning on your own. So in this article, John goes through why everyone should learn a little bit of classical Chinese, how to go about it, and what resources to use. And I think this last point is very important because as a beginner in a subject, it's very hard to find good resources. But John does a very good job of recommending a number of resources for beginners, intermediate and advanced students, and also for experts. So I recommend this article to two kinds of listeners. First, for those of you who think that you don't need to learn any classical Chinese, you probably need to think again, and John explains why. And the other group is those who are interested in classical Chinese and already want to learn more because all the recommendations and resources are there. Let's continue with the second most popular article from 2022, and that is How to Learn Chinese Characters as a Beginner. This is a complete rewrite of an earlier article, one of the earliest ones on hacking Chinese, in fact, and it originally came about because I taught complete beginners several years in a row at university, and I simply didn't have time to talk them through what to do and how to learn characters and so on because we had so many other things to do, so I ended up collecting all my advice in one place and published that article. I have, of course, learned a lot over the 15 years I've been learning and teaching Chinese, so this is an updated new version where I go through the basics for beginners specifically. So this is not about understanding Chinese characters in general, how to learn in the long term. It's basically the answer to the question, okay, my teacher gave me a bunch of words to learn by, say, Friday. How should I practice these things so I can nail the test and so I can remember them long term? So if you're a beginner or if you're teaching beginners, check out episode 103. And finally, the most popular article of 2022, drumroll, is the 10 best free Chinese listening resources for beginners, intermediate, and advanced learners. This article contains exactly what the title says, so it's basically a list of recommendations where I go through why I recommend them, what they are good for, why they might not be so good, and so on. But these are still the best resources for listening that I've been able to find, and I've specifically avoided resources that use a lot of English, because listening practice should be mostly about meaning-focused input that we talked about earlier when we talked about Paul Nation's 4 strands. If your podcast contains 80% English, that doesn't count as listening practice. It's only the 20% that are in Chinese that counts as listening practice. So if you don't know what to listen to in this month's listening challenge, head over to the article and check out my recommendations. And of course, if you have recommendations for listening resources, I'm always interested in expanding the list and updating it, and there will probably be a new version in 2023, so send me your recommendations and I'll consider adding them. The best way to do so is to go to the article itself and simply leave a comment, because that means that even if I don't include it, or before I have had time to look at it, other people can still find it by scrolling through the comments. So that was the most popular article, and let's now turn to the most popular podcast episodes. And like I said in the introduction, I thought that this would be closely tied to the most popular articles, but as we shall see, this is usually at least not the case. So starting at number 5, we have the only podcast episode that is in Chinese, and this is episode 78B, where I talk about text adventure games and how to use them in the Chinese language classroom. And this article is mostly aimed at teachers, which is why I wrote it in Chinese and also why I recorded it. Still, as a student, you can of course use most of the things that are being said here, it's just that the perspective is a little bit different. My guess is that this episode did well simply because it is the only one that is in Chinese, so it sticks out a bit and maybe that makes people more curious. I've had plans for making more content in Chinese for a long time now, it's just that that takes a lot more time and effort than I currently have available. If you are interested in the article content, i.e. the bit about text adventure games and how to use them in the Chinese language classroom, but don't feel up to reading or listening to the Chinese version, there is also an English version, but I should mention that they are not exactly the same. I wrote one of them first and then wrote the other, and then I didn't bother go back and change the first one. They both stand on their own, but they contain roughly the same content. Next, we have the 4th most popular podcast episode, which was episode 89, which is about what to read to improve your Chinese and why. So this podcast episode goes through a few different things. First, about why reading is good and why you should do more of it. And then it also discusses what you should read depending on what your goals are. It also touches on the discussion of authenticity versus comprehensibility. So on the one hand, it's good to read authentic texts that are not written specifically for language learners, because these texts tend to be more natural and this is the way Chinese is actually used. But on the other hand, these texts are typically very, very difficult compared to a text that's written specifically for a beginner, say. So if comprehensibility is the goal, then of course you should read graded content and content written for you in particular. Next up, we have number 3 on the list, and that is episode 99, How to Become Fluent in Chinese. And this one I have already talked about in this episode, but it doesn't overlap with a popular list, rather with my own personal list of favorite articles from last year. But since we have already talked about it, let's move on to number 2, which is episode 88, How to Learn Chinese Characters as a Beginner. And this one we have also talked about already, and this is the only one that actually overlaps between the popular articles and the popular podcast episodes. As I said earlier, I thought almost all the articles and episodes would overlap, but this is actually the only one that does. So let's wrap this up with the most popular podcast episode from last year, and that was episode 87, focusing on tone pairs to improve your Mandarin pronunciation. While I didn't expect this episode to do better than all the others, I do think it makes sense, at least in hindsight, because this article is about tone pairs, and there are 20 of these in Mandarin, and if you learn those 20 really, really well, you have most of pronunciation taken care of. Or at least you won't struggle with tones in most basic words. So my suggestion here is that you learn at least one common word for each of the 20 different tone combinations, and you learn it really, really well. You should be extremely sure that you're pronouncing it right, you should be able to do it without hesitation, and you should spend as much time as needed to get there. For some people, this might mean 10 minutes, for others it might mean 10 hours, or even longer, but you really, really need to master these tone pairs. And then you can apply the tone contour from the words that you know to words that you don't know or to words that you struggle with. So let's say, for example, that you're struggling with a word like 打开, which means to open, and you say something like 打开. You have a rising tone at the beginning instead of a low tone, as the third tone should be pronounced here. But now you have already memorized another word, 老师, 老师. So this is your memorized word for third tone plus first tone, and you're really good at saying 老师. And now when you say 老师, 老师, 打开, 老师, 打开, you can feel that the pitch contour is the same, the pattern is the same. You just move them from one word and impose that contour onto a different word that you're struggling with. And I've used this a lot in teaching, and I've heard from many people who've used this method to improve their pronunciation, and it works really, really well. So if you are struggling with tones, you should definitely check out episode 87. So those were the most popular articles and podcast episodes from 2022. I should also mention that there are other pages that are very popular on Hacking Chinese. For example, I have category pages where I collect all the articles for a specific category, such as beginner, listening, and so on. But rather than just listing all the articles, I also introduce that category. So if you're a beginner, this is where you will find general beginner advice. And if you're interested in, say, speaking ability, this is where you will find that general advice. You can find these pages by going to the sidebar on a computer or by scrolling down if you're on your phone. So that's it. We have wrapped up 2022. The only thing that remains now is thanking you for tuning into the podcast and for visiting the website. Receiving feedback from people who find Hacking Chinese helpful or useful is what keeps me motivated to create content. So an extra thank you to those of you who have responded to, say, the reader and listener survey, or who have gotten in touch in some other way. Happy New Year, and let's hope 2023 will be a good year for you and for Hacking Chinese. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.